Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to talk about the difference between Ecclesiastical Latin and Classical Latin. We'll mostly focus on the differences in pronunciation, and then I will discuss and basically respond to a lot of comments about the way I read Latin and the sort of pronunciation that I consider to be more valid. Alright, welcome back. As you know, on my channel I really like talking about ancient Rome, and particularly focusing on historical matters, of course. But even focusing on historical matters, when you talk about the ancient Romans, you do end up reading a lot of Latin names, a lot of you end up using a lot of Latin words, or at least that's what I like doing. So as a content creator and presenter, that's when you need to make a choice. What pronunciation will you use when you read Latin phrases? There were a lot of different kinds of Latin, and I have made a video about this, and if you're interested you can find the description. But today we will focus mostly on Classical Latin and Ecclesiastical Latin, although I will spend a few words also about Old Latin. So first of all, what is Ecclesiastical Latin? Well, Ecclesiastical Latin is the form of Latin used in the rites of Roman rites of the Catholic Church, although it is also used for other purposes. It is the official language of the Holy See, and it is the only surviving sociolect of spoken Latin. When we talk about Classical Latin, particularly Classical Latin pronunciation, we are talking about the reconstructed pronunciation. Now let me redefine the word reconstructed here. You see, Latin evolved continually over the centuries, and its pronunciation also changed constantly. That is a matter of fact. Although it is very difficult to thoroughly comprehend and understand how Latin was pronounced back in the days, because of course we have no recordings of it, one thing is for sure: Latin, the way it was pronounced by the Romans, was incredibly different and very different to the way Latin is pronounced today by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the reason why I've chosen to make this video is because whenever I read something in Latin, as you have noticed, I have sort of changed my policy, meaning that now I tend to use both ecclesiastical pronunciation and classical pronunciation. The reason for such choice is the fact that whenever I chose to simply use ecclesiastical pronunciation, then people who know about classical pronunciation, and most of the times people who are not Italians, will complain, telling me that ecclesiastical pronunciation is wrong. Whereas whenever I choose to use only classical pronunciation, then 90% of Italians watching my videos start complaining and calling me ignorant and telling me that I don't even know that the Latin e is actually supposed to be a monophthong, and so it's supposed to be pronounced e. Now both these comments are wrong, but I don't wish you to believe me. Let me prove you what I'm talking about. The first comment is wrong because although I am a great supporter of classical pronunciation, ecclesiastical pronunciation is also correct within its spectrum, meaning that it is a viable way of pronouncing Latin. Of course, what is important to remember is that it was not the way that Romans spoke. Of that, I'm absolutely adamant. So I do agree with people who do support classical Latin instead of ecclesiastical Latin as far as reading ancient Roman writers is concerned. For example, Vegetius or Vegetius. But on the other hand, going all the way to even to actually call ecclesiastical Latin wrong, then I wouldn't agree, because then we would have to consider wrong modern day English pronunciation or modern day Italian pronunciation. Ecclesiastical pronunciation is one of the sort of pronunciations that evolved, and we have to consider that some of its features, for example the e pronounced e, it's something that has been around for a very long time here in Italy, but it's not a modern thing at all. But I will get to this point and we'll learn a bit more details about this in a minute. On the other hand, all those Italians who go ballistic on me because I use classical pronunciations, you see, they are wrong as well, because people who get mad and call me ignorant because I say Caesar instead of Caesar are people who have only studied at high school or secondary school in Italy, okay? Because students, so teenagers in secondary school in Italy, only learn and are only taught Ecclesiastical Latin. So in a way, it's not really their fault, although attacking someone is never really a good thing to do, even if you're right. So never mind when you're wrong. But it's not entirely their fault. So I understand it, because again, I'm a teacher, I teach students, and I know what students are taught in Italy. On the other hand, all professors of university, all professors of secondary school and high school that I have talked about this with, all agree with me that classical pronunciation is Caesar with a separated diphthong, and we will get to the diphthongs in a moment, and in ecclesiastical pronunciation it would become Cesar or Cesar. So people who kept on studying Latin at university will know about classical pronunciation. So those who call me ignorant because I say I instead of they are ultimately the ignorant ones. Now, ecclesiastical Latin and classical Latin, it's not just a matter of pronunciation. There are also lexical variations. The syntax is simplified. Ecclesiastical Latin syntax is simplified, if simplified is compared to classical Latin syntax. And ultimately, the pronunciation is Italianate, okay? It's an Italianate pronunciation, meaning that it has a lot of common features with modern day Italian. The fact that the V is always pronounced as a consonant, V, whereas in classical Latin it was a short vowel, W. Veni, vidi, vici, veni, vidi, vici. And this leads us to our next point, the C, which in ecclesiastical Latin follows the same rules as Italian. When C is followed by I or E, it will be pronounced as a ch, whereas in classical Latin it's always pronounced as a k. Centurionis, centurionis. Same situation with the G. In ecclesiastical pronunciation, when G is followed by I and E, it will be pronounced as G, so Germanicus, whereas in classical pronunciation it's always pronounced like a G, so it becomes Germanicus. So what is classical pronunciation? How can we know that Romans actually said Caesar and not Caesar? Classical pronunciation is modern scholarship's best guess of what the heck was going on with Latin in the times of the Romans. Most of the times we're focusing on Republican time. So let's focus on the diphthong A, very quickly, okay? Now, what happened is that in Old Latin, this was pronounced I, even spelled that way. E sound was lowered to a E during Republican times, but it was still a diphthong, meaning that you had two distinct vowel sounds with the accent falling or the stress falling on the first vowel. So the pronunciation would become from I to I, Caesar. Towards the end of Republican times, however, we do have the beginning or the birth of this simplification from a diphthong to a monophthong, and I, E. But this was not constant. Literate and educated people will still speak the good Latin. In the countryside, people started simplifying I to E. This sound will start spreading during the empire, and it will become universal in the 5th century, so after the fall of the Roman Empire. So we should imagine that definitely upper class of Latin speakers will use I throughout the entirety of the late Republic and the Empire. From the 5th century Anno Domini onward, however, the sound I disappeared, and basically in Italy we have been pronouncing I into E for at least 1,500 years. So this is why, to Italian ears now, this sounds very, very weird, and this is why a lot of Italians actually try and refuse this. And this is why people get so aggressive towards me when I use the classical Latin pronunciation. And this is why some people, even after I bring the facts, will still tell me, yeah, but it's awful. And I don't agree, actually. I think Caesar sounds a lot cooler than Cesar, but hey, just personal preference, I suppose. But how do scholars know? How can you find out? Well, there are quite a lot of ways. For example, first of all, I'll just talk about a couple. First of all is checking out spelling mistakes. This is one way we can find out how people actually pronounce things in the past. For example, a spelling mistake is a mistake made from the fact that sometimes a writing system is not coherent to the sound that it produces. So for example, if you got a person misspelling a V into a U, then you will know that these people wrote it like a V but pronounced it like a U. Okay, this is because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to make that mistake. Something similar happens, for example, in English. I'll give you an example of this. When I was in England as a teenager, I remember that I was living with a friend of mine. We were sharing flats, and he was Irish. Okay, well, he still is Irish, I suppose. So he would make sometimes some spelling mistakes that only a native would make. Let me give you an example. You know the vowel O in English. Now basically it's a diphthong, okay? Because you write just one grapheme, but you pronounce it O, U, okay? O. So it's a diphthong, two vowels. Although it is pronounced O in words such as so, no, and go, in the word doctor it becomes a O sound. So it becomes a monophthong. And in the word in front, money, some, it actually becomes a sound. But when it's followed by an N and it's found at the end of a word, it will become a I sound. For example, Gordon, station, conversation. I was living at the time in a place called Gordon Street, okay? Now, my Irish friend, when he was writing our address on a letter, and he made a mistake and wrote Gorden. He made the mistake because he doesn't say Gordon, like for example an Italian would say, but he says Gordon, and so the sound is closer to a E sound, and so he made the mistake and wrote Gordon with a E. Okay, if someone were to see that mistake 1,000 years from now, they could guess that people in 2017, for example, wrote Gordon, but didn't pronounce it Gordon, but pronounced it Gordon. Another thing is seeing how other people in other countries actually spelled the name. And if you look at the way the Greeks wrote the name of the emperor, for example, and the Germans wrote the name of the emperor, you will notice that in both cases they will spell it with a K, suggesting that most likely the sound that they heard the Romans used was a K sound, not a Ch sound. These are just a couple of examples, but it was just to give an idea, an overall idea on how a reconstructed pronunciation is actually built up. There is a lot of work and a lot of research. Now, I myself support entirely classical pronunciation over ecclesiastical pronunciation as far as the language spoken by the Romans is concerned, and this is why whenever I play a Roman character in one of my videos, I always have these Romans use classical pronunciation. Of course, one thing is very important to keep in mind, from students to scholars, from pupils to professors, is to always have an open mind, which could completely change our current understanding of how Latin was spoken, in which case we should not just remain focused on our previous idea, but we should always be open-minded and ready for change. This is the only way to really and thoroughly approach learning. Okay, well, I think that this sort of sums it up. This is what I wanted to share with you today. Please let me know if you prefer ecclesiastical Latin or classical Latin. Let me know in the comments below. Alright then, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. I will see you tomorrow for my next daily upload. Valete!